gets on the plane. When the plane touched down, he was in Switzerland. And he spent most of the rest of his life in exile. I think Dr. Cunningham's going to say a little bit about that, so I won't say anymore. Okay, so that's a little bit about the life of Solzhenitsyn. Now, I promised to talk about the problem of evil. A lot of people, if you teach philosophy or teach theology, particularly Christian theology, but any kind of theistic theologies of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, people who are adamant non-believers almost always say that it's because of some sort of evil experience that has come their way. That's usually what it is. I'm not talking about people who just are sort of agnostic, but committed atheists usually become atheists because of the problem of evil, in my experience, anyway. Solzhenitsyn, strangely enough, because of his experience of evil, gave up on Marxism and turned to Christianity. So it's a very interesting story. My fourth point here, well, we can divide evil into two sorts. There's sort of the evil of the agent, what we might call moral evil or sin, okay, the one who does bad, okay, does evil. And then there's the evil of one who receives evil, suffering, we might call it. The first, the evil of the agents, Solzhenitsyn especially discusses in the Gulag Archipelago 1-4, a chapter called The Blue Caps, the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, so the Soviet secret police apparatus, okay, always wore blue, since even before the communists came to rule. And so he refers to all of these people as the Blue Caps in this chapter. Now, there are 3 points I want to make here. One is that Solzhenitsyn soon gave up the Marxist notion that some people are evil and some people are good. And so the main thing we have to do is get rid of the evil people so that the good would prevail. Okay? How should we put it? I think sometimes readers of Solzhenitsyn himself, and particularly the Gulag Archipelago, sometimes view him in the same way. That what he's writing is a political expose. That he's saying, look, those people are bad. Okay, but he's identified a different group of bad people. And so they need to be gotten rid of or somehow taken care of so that the rest of us can prosper. And so I'll just read a paragraph. So, he says, let the reader who expects this book, the Gulag Archipelago, to be a political expose slam its cover shut right now. If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere, insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various ages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change, and to that name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. Confronted by the pit into which we are about to toss those who have done us harm, in his case the Blue Caps, we halt, stricken dumb. It is, after all, only because of the way things worked out that they were the executioners and we weren't. From good to evil is one quaver, says the proverb. It's a Russian proverb he quotes. And correspondingly, from evil to good. Okay, so, you know, at first glance, this doesn't seem to be, perhaps, to be all that remarkable of an insight. But notice point 2, or B here, 4B. Marxism suggests that human beings are almost infinitely perfectible, or completely perfectible. That at the end of history, we will be, all of us, completely good. The evil classes will be destroyed, and only the good will remain. Through progress, through historical progress, we will attain this state. But of course, that does not correspond, does not correlate with the Christian notion of original sin. So Solzhenitsyn's doctrine of the dividing line within the human heart does correlate much closer with the notion of original sin. My point is that the insight begins to reject Marxism in favor of the Christian view of the human being. I'll say one more thing about this. Christians usually believe in conscience. That always provides some little bit of good within a human being. And Solzhenitsyn appeals to Christian conscience. But he says that, particularly among the blue caps and the Soviets generally, one really does see situations in which evil escalates. People with consciences usually can only do so much evil. Solzhenitsyn was a big fan of Shakespeare, and he says, look, Macbeth killed somebody and his conscience devoured him. Even the worst of Shakespeare's characters, the body count only goes to 10 or 12. These blue caps, though, it seems are off the charts. He uses an example from physics, whereas he says, for example, you know, you can make oxygen as cold as you want, below 100 degrees, minus 100 degrees Celsius, and it still remains a gas. You get to 183 below Celsius, and suddenly it becomes a liquid and starts to flow. A threshold condition is reached. You can shine a yellow light on lithium. Now nothing will be emitted. You increase the light to blue, and suddenly particles are emitted. A threshold has been reached. He does admit this, that it is possible for a human being to reach a certain threshold, beyond which it seems nothing can, perhaps they really cannot be returned from that point. He says that ideology is what supplies the threshold in the case of the blue caps. A set of ideas the Marxists bequeathed to the communists that made them think that what they were doing was right, was okay, was in fact needed to bring about progress. Without an ideology, he says, they never could have done that. And so he uses the Marxist word ideology. This is a standard Marxist doctrine, that right, our ideas are only products of our class consciousness. And so they're not real, our ideas. They're an epiphenomenon, not a true phenomenon. They call those ideas an ideology. Philosophy is an ideology. Well, you see, Solzhenitsyn says the ultimate ideology is the Marxist ideology. Okay, I got to move along here. I do want to say a little bit about suffering, because Solzhenitsyn, in the end, at the very end, he turns back to prison and he says, "Bless you, prison, for having been in my life." somehow as an experience of being in prison and being in the camps, he says he turned his life around. He would have been as bad as the Blue Caps if it hadn't been for that experience. Most people, he says, respond the other way when they go into camp. Well, what happened for him? He says when you go to camp, the first thing you experience is a mountain of grief. Your life is over, everything you had planned is done. And the best thing to do is just to assume that you are dead, or you will soon be dead. And yeah, your life is over earlier than you had planned. But best to accept that fact. Then one is faced with a choice. Survive at any cost, i.e. steal, squeal on the other prisoners, become an informant to the prison administration, or not, or risk death is the choice that you have. And he says once you renounce survival at any cost, suddenly things begin to get clearer in camp. And suffering, well, it leads to self-improvement. It makes the soul better. I would like to read a couple more passages here. This is one in which he raises the question of whether suffering is in fact a sort of punishment for us. And he says that he discussed this idea with a man named Dr. Boris Kornfeld. So Solzhenitsyn, on top of everything else, he developed stomach cancer while he was in the camps. And in the last year of his imprisonment in the camps, he had to have this tumor removed. And here's what he says, quote, "Following an operation, I am lying in the surgical ward of a camp hospital. I cannot move, I am hot and feverish, but nonetheless my thoughts do not dissolve into delirium. And I am grateful to Dr. Boris Nikolaevich Kornfeld, who is sitting beside my cot and talking to me all evening. The light has been turned out so it will not hurt my eyes. He and I, and there is no one else in the ward. Fervently, he tells me the long story of his conversion from Judaism to Christianity. This conversion was accomplished by an educated, cultivated person, one of his cellmates, some good-natured old fellow like Platon Karatayev. I am astonished at the conviction of the new convert, or at the ardor of his words. We know each other very slightly, and he was not the one responsible for my treatment. But there was simply no one here with whom he could share his feelings. He was a gentle and well-mannered person. It is already late, all the hospital is asleep. Kornfeld is ending up his story thus, quote, and on the whole, do you know, I have become convinced that there is no punishment that comes to us in this life on earth which is undeserved. Superficially, it can have nothing to do with what we are guilty of in actual fact. But if you go over your life with a fine-tooth comb and ponder it deeply, you will always be able to hunt down that transgression of yours for which you have now received this blow." Close quote. I cannot see his face. Through the window came only the scattered reflections of the lights of the perimeter outside, and the door from the corridor gleams in a yellow electrical glow. But there is such mystical knowledge in his voice that I shudder. Well, it turns out those were the last words of Boris Kornfeld. He was murdered that night in the camp and never regained consciousness and never said anything again. Solzhenitsyn says, well, with words like that in such circumstances, you don't just shrug something like that off. But, he says, I came to disagree with Kornfeld. Okay? if you try to say that one has somehow merited punishment, you, as he puts it, get all tangled up that way. Because then it seems that the people guarding them, they're jail keepers, they have done worse things than they have done, and they should be punished even more. But they aren't. Okay? So Kornfeld sounds a little bit like the men who came to see Job, right? And told him, you must have done something. So after a long time, he decides to reject Kornfeld as a universal law, but he says, you have to try to apply that in your own case and take it upon yourself. And so I'll read one more paragraph from this chapter. And as soon as you have renounced that aim of surviving at any price and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way, to transform it in a direction most unexpected to you. Once upon a time, you were sharply intolerant. You were constantly in a rush, and you were constantly short of time. And now you have time with interest. You are surfeited with its months and its years behind you and ahead of you. And a beneficial calming fluid pours through your blood vessels. Patience. You are ascending. Formerly, you never forgave anyone. You judged people without mercy, and you praised people with equal lack of moderation. And now an understanding mildness has become the basis of your uncategorical judgments. You have come to realize your own weakness, and therefore you can understand the weakness of others, and be astonished at another's strength, and wish to possess it yourself. The stones rustle beneath our feet. We are ascending. Skipping ahead, your soul, which formerly was dry, now ripens from suffering. And even if you haven't come to love your neighbor in the Christian way, you are at least learning to love those close to you. Okay? So, my point here is that Solzhenitsyn considers, point B, suffering as punishment in the story about Boris Kornfeld. He rejects that ultimately, but he does come to understand suffering as the cultivator of the soul, that one can achieve moral improvement through suffering. And he says it's easier if you have someone to suffer with, but it's not strictly necessary. Okay, so I need to bring this around to a conclusion. So I'll move a little more rapidly now. What is the solution that Solzhenitsyn offers us? Okay, yes, our souls have been improved through suffering. This massive amount of suffering that we have experienced. Well, what must we do? What must Russia do in order to get beyond this? In 1974, just as he was led into exile, he was working on a book with some other Russian intellectuals. Of course, this book couldn't be published in the Soviet Union either. The title they gave it was From Under the Rubble. How are we going to get out from under this mess that is the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union? What he has 3 essays in there, along with other people. They have great titles. One of them is as breathing and consciousness return. Okay, as crawling out from under the earth. But another is titled Repentance and Self-Limitation in the Life of Nations. Just as individuals need to repent of their own evil, whether they are agents or recipients of suffering, Even so, do regimes need to do this? Do nations need to do this? He talks about how in Germany there have been trials. 86,000 people, he says, have been condemned in these trials. And I would read you the passage, but time is moving along. He says, at some point, it's not rare in these trials, the criminal finally puts his head in his hands and asks for no more concessions from the court and says that he no longer wants to live and makes no more resistance, having been faced with the enormity of his crimes. He says the Germans have been forced to do that 86,000 times publicly. It's been reported in the press. The Russians refuse to do that. He talks about the great tradition of Russian repentance, how there had always been a day, once a year, when everybody repented. Debts were forgiven, wrongs were righted, or at least feuds were buried, and a day given to this sort of public repentance and reconciliation. He says we don't do that anymore, and our young people are coming to the conclusion that crime is not going to be punished, that sin does not require repentance. And he simply concludes the chapter by saying it's going to be horrible to live in such a country. Now, so repentance is the first thing that's necessary, and I mean, that's kind of obvious. That's a Christian notion, of course, again. A lot of people didn't understand how Christian Solzhenitsyn had become. But then self-limitation. Self-limitation, when we see that word, those of us who are philosophers think immediately of temperance or moderation. Sophrosune in Greek. So the Greek philosophers had all said that one of the things that human beings most need to do at the start, okay, before they can get to the higher virtues, they have to limit their animalic desires for food, sex, and drink, in particular, is what they had in mind. Okay, that it's not a very high virtue, but it's very necessary in order for the other virtues to emerge. But I think Solzhenitsyn means something more than that. That is somehow a reform. For Russia, it does mean things like sexual self-limitation. But for Russia, for example, a political repentance would mean turning inward, no more empire building. Okay? He did think that moving inward meant moving north and east, into Siberia. The Russians should try to develop their homeland rather than trying to conquer other peoples. For the West, he especially was opposed to Western acquisitiveness. And if you read him enough on this, it begins to sound like the self-limitation of God in the Incarnation, which we know from Paul, where he talks about how God did not deem equality, where Christ did not deem equality with God as something to be grasped at, but emptied himself, the kenosis, taking on the form of a servant, okay, and so forth, and suffering even death on the cross, i.e. the incarnation. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point, and because we want to give Dr. Cunningham a moment for response, and then we'll have take questions and comments. Okay. My back's kind of sore, so I'm just going to sit here and let.
I found another chair.
Oh, we got 2 chairs.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
You want to use cookie?
I was going to, that's all right.
You can do whatever you'd like. I have a chair for here afterwards.
Always, I don't want to mess up the camera.
Can we address conversation?
do the sensible thing and leave me off camera.
I mean, you're on that.
There goes that.
Yeah, he's on there. It should be
Yeah.
fine. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, David Calhoun invited me to come and do this. He was very happy to do it. I think there's something about, to a certain kind of mind, Solzhenitsyn is kind of like, when Beatles fans get together and talk about the Beatles discography, there's nothing bad about it, right? So this is certainly not a rebuttal kind of commentary, but something in support of, I think your summary was great, by the way. And you did leave off the 1974, which allows me to say a little bit about 1978, which is what I'm going to focus on tonight, which is when Solzhenitsyn made a very profound statement at the podium at Harvard University. But you said something that really struck me early on, and that Solzhenitsyn may have been the most underappreciated or even most important thinker of the last 100 years, and I think I'd agree with that. Evidence for that is that very few people actually read him or know who he is. And I say this even though I found Solzhenitsyn somewhat late in my life, or late in my academic career. And I think when I got to just talk about myself for just a second here, when I got to graduate school, I was a fully modernized guy. Grew up in post-war America, born in 1962, the year of Solzhenitsyn's Great Splash. But I served in the Navy for 6 years, went to Japan, opened up my own business. I was sort of the quintessential modern guy. I didn't really know what my underlying philosophy of anything was, other than, well, this is reality, and therefore it is what it is, and progress must be the iron law of the world. Well, when I got to graduate school, of course, I went to study Japanese literature, and spent a full year reading French post-structuralism. We never even studied Japan until I was 18 months into my program. But there, all my first year as an MA student taught me was how to seriously interrogate and critique all of the assumptions that I'd come to grad school with, not leaving me with anything particularly satisfying to replace it with. And then when I saw how universities actually worked, I became less and less enchanted with the idea of pursuing this as a career path. And there I was, ready to quit. I was going to pull the plug, get my PhD, because I didn't want to say I quit anything, but I was going to get my PhD and just bail, get a job at a bookstore or something. And then while wrestling with this decision, I had the opportunity to go to the Stanford Inter-University Center in Yokohama, Japan, where I studied advanced Japanese language. And there I met a young Christian guy. His name was Billy Stevens. And we got to talking. We were, I think, the only two Christians in the graduate school that I could find anywhere. And we got to talking about things. And it was he who actually said, have you ever read this thing? It's called The World Split Apart. And it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn's address at Harvard. I said, no, actually, I haven't read it. I knew who Solzhenitsyn was from the time I was a kid. He was the fierce-looking guy with the Mormon beard on the front cover of Time magazine all the time, right? And we all know that Solzhenitsyn had somehow succeeded in breaking free of the Soviet Union, and he was living in a little cabin somewhere up in the north of the woods, just angry at the world. That this was kind of the way I had known him through the pop culture. But I found out reading this, I read this document, and again, what I knew about grad school was that there was something about the modern progressive world that was worthy of critique and worthy of being beaten up regularly. And I knew, I guess I imagined myself to be some kind of a postmodernist, having had all of my assumptions about the world sufficiently destabilized. But what then do you do with this? I had no interest in the typical academic postmodern pastiche or thinly veiled Marxism or the rest of the nonsense that typically goes along with this. And then when I read this, I said, this is it. This is actually the statement of postmodernism that I can get my head around. And what it really is a statement of Christian values written by somebody who grew up in a post-historical world, written by somebody who'd grown up in a Marxist world. And so I found that what was so interesting about this particular text, when Solzhenitsyn went to Harvard in 1978, you can only imagine, here he was, he'd just been sprung free of the terrible life of the Gulag. And I can only imagine what the trustees of Harvard imagined he would say when he got up on the podium to give his address to the class of 1978. Certainly, he would be gushing forth with his gratitude for being allowed to get out of the Soviet Union and being allowed to come into this and to breathe the marvelous air of Jimmy Carter's America. I think that the liberal society that gave Solzhenitsyn, right, the greatest man of the Soviet Union, his freedom, should have been prepared to hear him gushingly praise everything wonderful about American culture and by extension Western culture to boot. He did nothing like that. I think everybody who went to this commencement speech probably came away surprised because he didn't say anything particularly flattering about modern Western culture, right? He certainly had nothing positive to say about the Soviet Union, but I guess he'd spent his whole career not being positive about the Soviet Union. So when he came to Harvard and said these things. I'm just going to share a few of the snippets from this speech, in particular snippets that have something to do with the themes that Dr. Kries has talked about. Here's a little piece that he has to say on the question of evil. I think you'll find this interesting. This is 1978. So in addition to being a great literary figure, a true philosopher, and a spiritual leader for the postmodern age, he was also a signpost, I think, showing the way out of our historical predicament. He was a prophet, I think, in many ways. He's talking about the freedom in America and criminality and freedom. He said, what shall we say about the dark realm of criminality as such? Legal frames, especially in the United States, are broad enough to encourage not only individual freedom, but also certain individual crimes. The culprit can go unpunished or obtain undeserved leniency with the support of thousands of public defenders. When a government starts, when a government starts an earnest fight against terrorism, public opinion immediately accuses it of violating the terrorists' rights. There are many such cases. I think in 1978, terrorism as a theme wasn't really on the map yet. That seemed to be a post-Cold War phenomenon, but he nailed the phenomenon already. Then he writes, such a tilt of freedom in the direction of evil. So he's equating the protecting the terrorists' rights more or less with evil. Such a tilt in the direction of evil has come about gradually, but it was evidently born primarily out of a humanistic and benevolent concept according to which there is no evil inherent to human nature. The world belongs to mankind, and all the defects of life are caused by wrong social systems which must be corrected. In other words, find the evil people, get rid of them, and all will be well. Because strangely enough, though the best social conditions have been achieved in the West, there is still criminality, and there is even considerably more of it than in the pauper and lawless Soviet society. Well, such as it was in 1978. He also talks, another question here that I wanted to raise about this. Another, where is this question here? Again, dealing with the question of evil, he writes, a new way of thinking. He's talking about the modern humanism, a new way of thinking which imposed on us its guidance and did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any higher task than the attainment of happiness on earth. It based modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend to worship man and all his material needs. Everything beyond the physical well-being and the accumulation of material goods, all other human requirements and characteristics of a subtler and higher nature were left outside the area of attention of state and social systems, as if human life did not have any superior sense. That provided access for evil, of which in our days there is a free and constant flow. Mere freedom does not in the least solve all of the problems of human life, and it even adds a number of new ones. Right, so this is the essential critique of modernization theory, or modern progressive mind in general, is that somehow, right, if we believe in an iron law of historical progress, which certainly comes from Marx. I mean, I don't think even Adam Smith would have been bold enough to, but most of the founding fathers of America knew that this would fall into ruin, right, if certain things were not upheld. only Marx says it is leading to a beautiful paradise on earth, right? And so this is actually what the progressive mind has adopted from Marx, assuming that somehow we are simply, through the mere passage of time, we will eradicate unhappiness and sinfulness. We don't have sinfulness anymore. We will eradicate bad politics, we will eradicate bad thinking, we will simply eradicate anything that makes us unhappy, which I think is just a monstrosity when you look, yet it is the underpinning of the modern progressive historical consciousness. So I said, again, for me, this was just such a breath of fresh air and sunlight coming into my mind. I finally had a reason to pursue this academic career, if only to try to fashion myself in some way in the model of Solzhenitsyn and try to work on his project, such as it was. Now, the last two more things I'd like to share, but one of the most inspiring pieces of his literature, I think, is the last thing he writes to the students of Harvard of 1978. He writes, "If the world has not come to its end, it has approached a major turn in history equal in importance to the turn from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It will exact from us a spiritual upsurge. This again is part of the solution that you mentioned, self-restraint. What must we do to bring about a change? It will exact from us a spiritual upsurge. We shall have to rise to a new height of vision, to a new level of life where our physical nature will not be cursed as in the Middle Ages." But he's not talking about going back in time. It will not be cursed as in the Middle Ages, but even more importantly, our spiritual being will not be trampled upon as in the modern era. They didn't say in the Marxist world, he said in the modern era. He goes, "This ascension will be similar to climbing onto the next anthropologic stage." He writes, "No one on earth has any other way left but upward." Now this leaves as a to-do list, this leaves a lot of details to be desired. But I think the last thing you want to do is really attach yourself to anybody who has a plan. I mean, these are the things that seem to get us into real trouble. But just the idea to question who we are, to again, maybe to embrace traditional, even a traditional Western or Soviet notion of repentance, of a sense that atonement is needed, not just for our souls, but for the historical process itself, which has fallen into wild disarray. I think that this is something that all of us have to, really we have an obligation to read people like Solzhenitsyn. And every year, I can't say that I've become like Solzhenitsyn in my career path. But one thing I do, every year when I teach my History 112 course, I sit down, we go back to third grade, and we sit in the class, you were there, weren't you? And we read through The World Split Apart by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and no one gets out of this room unless they take one of these copies. So this is my gesture to Soviet authoritarianism. You must read this. And so everybody's going to take one of these, and you'll notice little numbers on the sides of the paragraphs. This is where the students know that they're supposed to read the next paragraph. You can read it silently to yourself. That's okay, but you have to take it. So this is my present, my handout for the evening. I think you'll find it one of the most remarkable statements of history, self-restraint, critique of American society, critique of Western society. And well, that's all I have to say. But I think the last thing that Solzhenitsyn leaves us with this speech is hope. That there really is hope, and even in the darkest of times. And nobody can speak about darkness like a decorated Soviet army officer that spent 8 years in prison. I think in addition to making fun of the mustache, he also wrote to his friend that he was noticing the Russian troops were being given orders to abuse the local civilian populations, which he couldn't get his head around. So he does write this to his buddy, how a Soviet army officer didn't know that the censors were going to look at his letters. I don't know. The one lapse of brilliance in his whole life, I suppose. But yeah, he was, for somebody with that much status, a new Soviet man, to spend that many years of his life in prison. He knows a lot more about darkness than any of us have seen yet, so certainly worth heeding. But anyway, thank you very much, and thanks for coming out. I'm going to stand at the door. You guys are going to take one of these. So thank you, and thank you, Doug, and thanks, Dr. Calhoun.
Why don't you just join Doug in the chair there?
I'll do that.
And we'll have a panel. So questions, comments?
I just want to make two really
Okay,
quick
go ahead,
things.
please do.
Response to that, and then let others speak. So when I was talking about how much we owe to Solzhenitsyn, I mean, there are, maybe not for the young people here, but for those of us with at least a little gray hair, I mean, the Soviet Union was the greatest political problem of our time. I never thought I would see the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Solzhenitsyn did more than anyone to bring that about. There are a lot of people who have a lot, played important roles in that. But Solzhenitsyn had spilled the beans and told people what was going on, and it was indisputable after this. And so the French left just collapsed, and even in this country, you know, for a long time, the truth about Stalin was hidden. I think Uncle Joe was our guy, and I think he still holds records for the number of times appearing on the cover of Time magazine, things like this. So we owe Solzhenitsyn a lot for that, and that's what I meant. The thing I just remark about the Harvard address is that it fell on completely deaf ears. I mean, this ruined his reputation in the United States. But he says it's very interesting. You know, the press didn't know what to make of this because they thought Solzhenitsyn was all about liberty and freedom, and you know, we're going to stick it to the man, and that kind of thing. And when he comes out with this statement about morality, they didn't know what to say. But Solzhenitsyn said he started getting all of these letters from the American heartland expressing agreement with it, and he was very encouraged by that correspondence.
He was the darling of the intelligentsia before that.
Yeah.
Right? So once he'd come out with his Christian values,
Yeah,
that shifted.
that they didn't know what to do with that. Let's have questions or comments.
Well, can I have one more
Oh,
comment?
sure.
I guess we owe some debt to Khrushchev as well. I mean, he really, you can track the contours of Solzhenitsyn's career with Khrushchev's own status. And once Khrushchev was bounced out of office, that's when he wrote other books, but he found himself in hot water with his government censors.
I guess. I don't, he doesn't come across, you know, to most people in the West as being exactly enlightened, but
No,
but
that's right.
somehow we
Yeah.
owe something to Khrushchev.
Well, this has been fascinating. This is far more than I knew about Solzhenitsyn before.
In the archipelago, I think one of the biggest mistakes is to view it simply as a chronological order of the sins of the Soviet Union, because it has what absolutely dumbfounded me as I read through an abridged version. Was how much he had to say on human nature, and how much just as when and then this leads into the question for you guys, when he was in prison and he was when he was in the Gulag and he was a couple months away from when his end date that he thought he was going to be able to get out, or was told he was going to be able, your sentence is done here at this time. He describes a moment when when a riot is happening in the Gulag, and in this moment, as people shoving, people getting shot up, and he's trying to get back into his hut, but he's the last guy. If I'm remembering this correctly, he describes this moment of prison sickness that reached its climax, where he looked around at the insanity of everything that was going around him, at all the innocent people, and they were being shot for no reason, and all this stuff. And they were the people the liberators. They were liberating themselves from the yoke. He just became so, he had this, what he could only describe as prison sickness. That was an exact contrary to what he had to say about surviving in the Gulag. It wasn't, I need to get out of here. It's, this is categorically wrong. That's, so, what more have you guys, do you guys see anything else through the archipelago that really resonates with that? About not fighting against the totalitarians just because you want to get out from underneath their yoke, but standing against them because they're actually wrong. They're wrong. Sorry, that's long.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So, the archipelago is divided into 7 parts. I talk mostly about the middle part, okay, the central part, where he talks especially about the soul. You're asking about part 5, okay, and he talks in part 5 about how, he says, we were often asked, well, why did we put up with it? Why did we stand for it?
Yeah.
Why didn't you rebel and fight back? And which seems like a silly question to me in a way, but he finds it very important to say that we did fight back.
Yeah.
And he talks about 3 different ways they fought back. The third that he discusses is the revolts. At Kengir, there was one at Ekibastuz in Kazakhstan too, where he was. And that scene where he says, suddenly, we were all running to try to get in the door to the tent. Not that the tent was going to turn back any bullets anyway.
Yeah.
And he said, for some reason I wasn't anxious at that point. I sort of didn't care if I lived anymore at that point. The second reason, the second way they fought back, interestingly enough, is by escape. And he tells a story about all of these guys who were trying to escape and spent their whole, they'd get caught immediately, and they'd immediately be thinking about how they were going to get away again. That was their form of resistance. But before he talks about any of those, he talks about poetry as a form of resistance, about how there was another man that he especially knew named Selim, who composed poetry while they were in prison in order to be able to remember what had happened. Solzhenitsyn says that he had done, with verse, poetry is a mnemonic device that helps you remember things. He says he was able to memorize 12,000 lines of verse. And he made a kind of rosary out of beads.
With the bread?
With bread that would help him. He'd go through the whole poem once a month. And so he could remember these things. And he came across another man there named Selim who was doing something similar. Selim died and never published his poem. So Solzhenitsyn remembered a little bit of it and preserves it here. So, what's my point? Poetry, escape, uprising, these are all ways of resistance in Solzhenitsyn's mind.
I know both of you are interested in politics and political philosophy, and I'm going to take up the challenge of your comment, Dr. Kries, that we owe more to Solzhenitsyn. And the way that you framed that was that he had a response to a kind of decadent conception of liberty or liberation, that is the freedom to do whatever the heck you want. And the Harvard address, so this goes to your comments too, Dr. Cunningham, that the Harvard address is the decadent liberalism, I guess we could say, of do whatever you want, or be free, or have this conception of freedom as latitude for action, I suppose we could say, turns out to be destructive or corrupting for the soul. Now, you said, Dr. Kries, that we owe him more than perhaps any other person in the 20th century. And yet, it seems like the place we find ourselves now is a replication of, or if anything, I mean, an extension of the project of do whatever you want, or liberty as the as latitude for license or whatever. So, I mean, you've sketched out to us. I think I already know where you're going to go with this, but if I just ask you, so how do we continue to receive the message, or what continuing message should contemporary Westerners, Americans look for in reading texts like the Gulag?
Well, he established, or he argued, that politics is soulcraft, ultimately. Okay, and so a lack of attentiveness to soul was the fundamental problem of the Marxists that ruled the Soviet Union. Or as he keeps repeating actually in that chapter, the Socratic dictum, know thyself. They weren't attentive to themselves. They didn't understand themselves, and misunderstood in particular the problem of evil. Okay, and now, so they used that inattentiveness to adopt an ideology that made it, that was non-self-correcting. That there was nowhere to go with that ideology, and they were able to force it on people. And what I meant by saying we owe him so much is that he revealed the truth about this ideology so that people came to reject it. But your point about freedom, we have to be a little bit careful. There's a couple of points in the Gulag Archipelago. One I was just reading recently, in which he says, we all admit, everybody admits that, and of course this isn't quite accurate, but that freedom for the sake of freedom goes nowhere, that that's a dead end. Okay, we need, and what matters is moral improvement. And then he raises the example of Tolstoy, who was Solzhenitsyn. He wanted to be Lev Tolstoy. And he wanted, and these books that I've been talking about aren't even his greatest books by his own standards. His big book was what he wanted to do was write this incredible history of the Russian Revolution, just as Tolstoy had, what he had done for the French Revolution, he wanted to do for the Russian Revolution. And he did complete it, and it's an extraordinary book. The University of Notre Dame Press is bringing out translations of the rest of it. So I'm hoping in my retirement I'll be able to read it all. The second one, November 1916, is probably his most Christian book, incidentally. Okay, but about freedom. He said Tolstoy said that freedom didn't count for anything, and that only moral improvement mattered. And Solzhenitsyn says, but Tolstoy didn't know the lack of political freedom that we knew. And so in other words, freedom still matters. It's not the end, but it's still a necessary means in order to move forward. So there's more nuance there in Solzhenitsyn than we might think. But yeah, I mean, it's about ends or soulcraft, ultimately.
So could you make a distinction between freedom and license?
Well,
Because
yeah, in this
some of what you're
passage,
describing sounds like license. And doesn't true freedom end up with moral improvement? I mean, if you look at the Catholic definition of freedom, it seems like that's what that leads you to.
the Christian says that ultimately freedom is freedom from sin. that the freedom to do good is the only kind of freedom that ultimately matters. I do think Solzhenitsyn, though, thinks that we'll have to, as a practical matter, give some people just political freedom or license. Okay, we can't control everything about human freedom. If you give people even political freedom, some of them will abuse it. Okay, most of the people in the Gulag chose wrongly, and they debased themselves rather than improve themselves. And Solzhenitsyn absolutely admits that. So, yeah, you're quite right. License isn't what we really need in Solzhenitsyn's view. Okay? What ultimately we need is to be free from sin, free to practice virtue, to be good. But I do think Solzhenitsyn thinks that there's a veneer, there's a minimum, let's put it that way, of sort of freedom in the lesser sense, almost as license, to freedom to do what you want. It's not the highest thing, but it's one necessary thing that we're going to have to some degree in order for higher forms of freedom to emerge.
Kind of like free will,
Yeah, yeah.
the freedom to
enough.
choose
Right.
good or evil.
I don't think he would have seen what passes for freedom in the post-war West as real freedom at all. It's just, he uses the word, it's imposed on us, and pop culture is imposed on us. So
Well, it's
freedom-
license.
Yeah, well, it's licensed,
It's
but it's
the freedom to do whatever the hell you want
and also
without
encouragement,
expecting any consequence.
but also the encouragement to do what's wrong. But I don't think people would use their freedom to be licentious if they were being properly guided morally. And I think he sees the fall with the West is that it doesn't just leave you open to a menu of choices, but it directs you towards the wrong ones. So that what we call freedom is it becomes its opposite. It becomes its own kind of prison. But that's also the Catholic vision of sin and freedom, right? That if you're sinning, you're not free. If you're being licentious, you're not free.
There was something that I heard recently when you talk about reversing things. And the ordered mind uses his intellect informed by a rightly formed conscience to basically dictate to the will. He uses his emotions to propel the will to complete the act. The reverse is you use your emotions to dictate to the will, and you simply use your intellect to rationalize the bad behavior. It's just it's 180-degree turn in how you process things.
Is that Edith Stein by any chance? Is that what you're reading? Or?
I think that was Thomas Aquinas. But at any rate, what Western culture does is they encourage us to use our emotions to make our decisions instead of our intellect.
Fair enough, sure.
And then our intellect just rationalizes it.
Would you, Dr. Cunningham, include, so you just said recently, that what Solzhenitsyn would also include as a prison is the fact that we are so free that we're even free to do what's wrong. And would you say that that is the base that would be his main critique of the French left, or of the intellectuals that said that the Soviet Union was a legitimate or a moral power?
Could you say the last part again?
So you have your atypical 1970s, 1960s French intellectuals like making excuses for Cambodia and the killing fields in the name of communism and progressivism. Would you say that would be his main critique of those guys?
I think, even taking a page out of Marx to use against Marx, I think he would say any narrative or consciousness that's being formed, that's based upon a lie, it is a false consciousness. And this is a topic that comes up a lot, especially in the history of Soviet penal institutions, is the manipulation of sanity and insanity. You know, it's funny, lately the term gaslighting pops up a lot in the pop culture. You're familiar with the term gaslighting? It comes from a movie that was made back in 1940 of a guy that convinces his wife she's crazy. So the movie is called Gaslight. Right? So basically, what I think Solzhenitsyn didn't use that term, but would see something similar taking place in a culture that is based upon a lie, that you are trained to invert values. You must say that white is black and black is white for the entire structure to work. So you aren't just led down the path into perdition, but you become insane at the same time. And I think that's what he found so offensive. I think that was it has something to do with his reactions in the Gulag. Is that you're not just your spirit is being assaulted by forcing you to deny that green is green.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and especially in France in 1968, that's what they were saying. A bunch of affluent kids were destroying police cars while the police were cowering in fear.
Yeah.
And who were the victims? Who were the oppressors?
Right.
And I think such things. My reading of Solzhenitsyn is that he really was in a lifelong quest for sanity, in addition to spiritual, because he had no access to the spirit. He was living in a world in which the dichotomy was insane versus sane. I don't know. It's really. I think it's a huge component of this whole mentality.
But then the fundamental critique of progressivism is just a refusal to admit human evil.
Yeah. Well, as he would put it, for sure.
Well, our human evil is a temporary impediment between now and attaining some final justifying goal.
They can be cured with human action.
If you just kill enough people.
Yeah. Or send 8-year-olds to the Gulag for sticking up grains as fries.
Are we?
I think we're out of time. Yeah, let's thank our speakers.
Can I just make one more little
Yes, please.
point? Just to finish the story, so we may not know. So Solzhenitsyn finally settled in Vermont, near Cavendish, Vermont. He visited Oregon, incidentally, thought about moving to Oregon. There's a community of what are called the Old Believers, Christians in Oregon, Russians who had been persecuted from the time of Peter the Great, I believe it was, in the 17th century. Settled in Oregon. He thought about living there. He settled in Vermont in the end. Finished his enormous history of the Russian Revolution, which he called the Red Wheel. And then, that was in 1994, and he realized he could go back if he wanted. And so he flew to the eastern edge of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, of Russia now, and took the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way across, stopping to talk with people in these little villages as he went, and then after, I don't know, a month or so, finally arrived in Moscow. He was almost universally, they weren't interested. Solzhenitsyn comes preaching the need for repentance and personal improvement and self-reform, self-limitation, and so forth. And it pretty much fell on deaf ears. He retired to obscurity in Moscow. He did write one more big book on the Russian Jews, the history of the interrelationship between Russia and her Jewish population, called 200 Years Together. But interestingly enough, at the end, so right before he died about 10 years ago, there was a resurgence of interest in Solzhenitsyn. They started to make some television programs of some of his works, and just before he died, it was, or maybe it was just after now, Putin himself agreed that selections from Solzhenitsyn ought to be part of the high school curriculum in Russia. And so students must read Day in the Life, a short story called Matryona's Home, which is about self-limitation, the need for self-limitation, and selections from the Gulag Archipelago, along with certain things from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and so forth. I don't know. We'll see what effect these books have on the Russian character going forward.
Thank you, Torsi.